Okay, so you're thinking about trying out amateur radio, ham radio, but you're not quite ready to commit to a whole textbook before
Right.
you even know if you're into it.
Yeah.
We totally get it. That's why we asked you to send in Dan Romanchik's No-Nonsense Technician Class License Study Guide. And let me tell you, the no-nonsense part,
Yeah.
he means it. This thing is jam-packed with info.
It really is.
So think of this deep dive as your cheat sheet before you dive into the deep end.
I like that analogy because a lot of people, they hear ham radio and they just think of, chatting with someone across town.
Right.
But there's way more to it, like way more than you'd expect.
It's true.
It's this blend of electronics, radio waves, science, even a little bit of, how to behave yourself on the airwaves.
Right. Like international communication, but there's etiquette involved.
Exactly.
And Dan really emphasizes in this guide that getting licensed, it's not the finish line.
Oh, no.
It's really just the beginning.
It opens the door.
It opens the door to a whole world
A whole world.
of constant learning, always exploring, which I love. Speaking of, I was surprised to learn only 26 out of 35 multiple choice questions, right, to be a technician class operator.
That's right. That's all it takes.
That's it.
And that gets you access to frequencies above 30 megahertz, which includes that popular 2-meter band, so that's great for local communication. You can even do some Morse code if you're feeling old school.
See, that's what I thought. So you're saying I don't have to learn Morse code anymore?
Nope, not anymore.
No more Morse code requirement for any license level.
Not anymore. They got rid of that.
That's amazing. Okay, wait, but before we get ahead of ourselves, before we have you chatting across continents,
Yeah.
Dan starts with the fundamentals in this guide, like basic electrical principles.
Right, got to start somewhere.
And he explains it in a way that anyone can understand.
He does a really good job with that.
Even if you've never even looked at a circuit board before,
It's true.
he breaks down this concept of current, right? It's just the flow of electrons.
Like think of it like water flowing through a pipe.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's your current.
That makes sense. And then he goes into Ohm's law,
Right, Ohm's law.
which I vaguely remember from high school physics, but he makes it relevant.
Yeah, it's the relationship between voltage, current, and resistance.
Yeah.
And he makes it make sense.
Yeah. Yes. Finally, all those equations are good for something.
Right. Like those problems with the light bulb circuits and figuring out the resistance, remember those.
Okay, see, this is already making me feel smarter just talking about it. But then it gets really interesting when the guide dives into electronic components.
Okay, yeah. This is where it starts to get fun.
We're talking capacitors, which store energy in electric fields. So imagine
Wow.
like tiny lightning bolts trapped inside these little components.
That's a great way to put it. And then you got inductors, too. They store energy, but in magnetic fields.
Okay, so they're like the opposite?
Kind of.
Hmm.
But here's the cool part. They work together to create these things called resonant circuits.
What do those do?
They're like the gatekeepers, right? They make sure only the frequencies you want get through.
Oh, so they help you tune into a specific station.
Exactly. Otherwise, it would just be a jumbled mess of noise.
Okay, that makes way more sense. But going back to the guide,
Yeah.
it also gets into radio waves, which, fun facts.
Oh, I love fun facts.
They travel at the speed of light.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
Right. That's how fast a radio signal can literally travel across the world.
Exactly. And the guide does a good job breaking down, frequency and wavelength and how they're related.
Okay, because I always get those confused.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
So lower frequencies actually have longer wavelengths, which is why, AM radio can travel so far.
Exactly. That's why you can pick up AM stations hundreds of miles away.
Yeah.
But FM, with its higher frequency, has a shorter range.
See, that's what I'm talking about. This deep dive, already it's worth it.
Right.
Okay, but it's not just about sending out signals randomly, right?
Oh, no.
The guide also talks about different ways those signals travel, different propagation modes.
Right, because they don't just shoot out in a straight line.
Yeah, what's the difference between, say, VHF and HF?
So VHF and UHF, those are more your line of sight kind of waves. Good for local communication,
Oh, okay.
but they don't travel as far. HF, though,
Yeah.
HF can bounce off the ionosphere.
What?
Yeah, and reach the other side of the globe.
No way.
Yeah.
That's insane. Okay, so we've got these signals bouncing all over the place, but we need something to catch them, right?
We do. That's where antennas come in.
Antennas. Okay, I have a soft spot for antennas.
They are pretty cool looking.
They're so cool, but they're obviously crucial. And this guide talks about all different kinds, like Yagis, which I always picture on top of, like a news van or something.
Yagis are great because they can be directional, so they boost your signal in a specific direction.
Oh, that makes sense.
And then you've got your dipoles, which are simpler but super effective.
And those are the ones that look like, kind of like two arrows pointing in opposite directions.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, those are cool. But I feel like this is where it starts to get a little technical, right?
Well, it can. The guide does get into things like impedance matching and SWR, which stands for standing wave ratio.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of SWR, but I don't really understand it.
Yeah, it can be a little tricky. Basically, you want the impedance of your radio, your feed line, and your antenna to all match up as closely as possible.
Why? What happens if they don't?
You lose signal, which is a bummer.
Oh, that makes sense.
Think of it like plumbing, right? If
Yeah.
you've got pipes of different sizes all hooked together, you're going to have water pressure issues.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So the guide also emphasizes how important it is to understand your equipment because things can go wrong.
Oh, they definitely can.
And thankfully, Dan covers common transmitter and receiver problems like interference, distortion, even the dreaded RF feedback, which
RF feedback.
I've heard that can really mess things up.
It can ruin your audio, for sure.
Yeah, that's no good. And speaking of no good, this guide does not mess around when it comes to safety.
Safety first, always.
Right, like a whole section on RF hazards, proper grounding, even lightning protection, which...
Seriously, do not skip that part.
You won't.
Because at the end of the day, ham radio is a privilege, not a right.
That's a good point.
And with that privilege comes responsibility.
Absolutely. It's not just about having fun. It's about doing so safely and ethically.
Exactly.
And speaking of ethics, Dan also gets into operating procedures, like how to communicate effectively on repeaters, which, by the way, are basically like signal boosters, right?
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, cool. So the guide talks about repeaters, how to use them properly, how to participate in contests without causing chaos, and it even gets into digital modes like packet radio.
Which is like email over radio waves, which is pretty cool.
That's amazing. There's so much to explore. Okay, this is blowing my mind a little bit.
It's a lot, but it's exciting stuff.
It is exciting, but I think we've probably overwhelmed our listeners enough for one part, don't you think?
Probably a good place to take a break. But don't worry, we'll be back with more soon.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, that's for sure.
It really is.
But that's the thing about this hobby. You're never really done learning.
True.
Which is part of what makes it so great.
I totally agree. And this guide, it doesn't just throw you into the technical stuff, you know?
Right.
It also talks about the history of ham radio.
Oh, yeah, it's got a rich history.
And how it can be used for public service, like in emergencies.
That's one of the things that really sets it apart, I think.
Absolutely. Like, it's cool to chat with someone across the world, don't get me wrong, but knowing that you could be that crucial link in an emergency,
It's a big deal.
that's amazing. And Dan mentions these organizations, RACES and ARES, which train ham radio operators to provide communication during emergencies, like when everything else goes down.
Exactly. Like when there's a hurricane or a big earthquake and the power's out, cell service is down.
Right. It's like, what do you do?
Ham radio operators, they're the ones who can still communicate.
They become the lifeline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Relaying information, coordinating relief efforts, even helping families connect with each other when they've been separated. It's pretty amazing.
That's incredible. And they actually have training programs to prepare for these scenarios, right? Like, what kind of stuff do they cover?
So they'll teach you about radio operation, obviously, but also message handling, emergency procedures, all that stuff.
Wow, so you're really ready for anything.
Yeah, it's like being part of this like highly skilled volunteer network, you know,
Yeah.
ready to jump into action when needed.
That's so cool.
But it's not just about having the knowledge, right? You got to practice those skills, stay current on the protocols.
Oh, absolutely, because like they say, practice doesn't make perfect, it makes...
Permanent.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, but speaking of high-pressure situations,
Yeah.
Dan mentions traffic handling in emergencies, and I'm not going to lie, that sounds a little...
A little overwhelming.
Maybe. Like, what even is that?
I see. It's a little less about traffic jams and more about managing the flow of messages between different stations.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Because during an emergency, clear communication is key.
Right.
Right? You're relaying vital information.
Yeah, and people are counting on you.
Exactly. So you got to be accurate, you got to be clear, and you got to stay calm under pressure. Think of it like being a radio dispatcher, but for, potentially life-saving information.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of pressure.
It can be, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
I bet. Okay, so that's why they teach you to say, like, alpha for A and bravo for B.
Exactly. Phonetic alphabets, they eliminate confusion,
Which is crucial.
especially when you're dealing with weak signals or a lot of background noise, which, let's face it, happens a lot in emergencies.
Right. So you want to be crystal clear.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone from the basics of electricity to potentially saving lives.
That's ham radio for you. It's got it all.
This hobby really does have it all. I'm kind of blown away right now.
Like I told you, it was more than just chatting across town.
Seriously. Okay, but for our listener who's just tuning in, maybe feeling a little overwhelmed, what are some of the, key takeaways, especially if they're just starting out?
Well, first of all, don't panic.
Right.
It's easy to get bogged down in all the technical details.
Oh, for sure.
But remember, this guide, it's a starting point.
Right.
Don't expect to be an expert overnight.
Yeah.
Start with your technician class license, dip your toes in the water, and go from there.
Exactly. And the cool thing is you can always keep learning.
Always.
There are new operating modes, different antennas to try, even those digital modes like packet radio, which I still think is super cool.
It's like having a whole other world of communication at your fingertips.
It really is. Okay, before we move on though,
Yeah.
can we talk about Q signals for a second?
Q signals. Oh, yeah, they sound kind of mysterious.
They do. What are they? Some kind of secret ham radio code?
Laughs. Not really a secret code, but they are a clever way to streamline communication,
Okay.
especially in Morse code. Because imagine trying to tap out a whole sentence using just dots and dashes.
Oh my gosh, that would take forever.
Right. So Q signals are like shortcuts, three-letter codes.
Like what?
Like QRM means I'm being interfered with.
Oh, that's handy.
Right. Way quicker than tapping out the whole thing.
That's so smart. Okay, so it's like their own shorthand.
Exactly.
Love it. Okay, and then the guide also explains simplex and duplex operation, which...
Yes, the two sides of the communication coin.
Right. What's the difference again? I always mix them up.
Okay, so simplex. Think of your walkie-talkies.
Okay, got it.
You're transmitting and receiving on the same frequency.
So only one person can talk at a time.
Exactly. It's great for local stuff, but you got to take turns. Duplex, though, that's like your cell phone.
Oh.
You're using two different frequencies.
So you can talk and listen at the same time.
Exactly. Simultaneous two-way communication, no need to switch back and forth.
Okay, so duplex is like a two-way street for radio waves, and simplex is a one-way street.
Perfect analogy.
Right. Okay, that makes so much more sense.
Good. Glad I could clear that up.
Me too. Because the guide mentions that most repeaters use duplex operation,
They do?
which explains why you need to set your radio to a specific frequency offset to use them.
Exactly. That's how the repeater knows which signal is yours and which one to retransmit.
It's like a signal traffic cop up there.
Laughs. Exactly. Making sure everything flows smoothly.
Love it.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of keeping things smooth,
Yeah.
interference.
Ugh. The nemesis of every radio operator.
All right. It's like the bane of our existence.
Pretty much. But the guide talks about that, too.
It does, thank goodness, because it can come from anywhere.
Right, it really can, both internal and external sources.
Okay, so it's not always my neighbor's fault.
Not always, no.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's as simple as a loose connection in your own setup.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Or maybe you've got some poorly shielded cables acting like little antennas, picking up stray signals.
Wow, I never thought about that.
It happens. Even something as simple as a fluorescent light can cause interference.
No way.
It's true.
So what do you do? Like, how do you even begin to troubleshoot that?
Well, the guide has some good tips.
Oh, good.
But the first step is always to check your own equipment.
Right, make sure it's not you.
Exactly. Look for loose connections, grounding issues, that sort of thing.
Okay, and then if it's not you, then you can start accusing the neighbors.
Well, not cues necessarily,
Yeah.
but you can start looking at external sources like power lines, appliances, even atmospheric conditions can play a role.
Wow, so it's like a radio mystery sometimes, trying to figure out where that annoying buzz is coming from.
It can be, but
Yeah.
that's part of the fun, right?
Yeah.
Solving the mystery, getting that crystal clear signal.
True, true. Okay, but before we get too far off track, we have to talk about antennas again.
Antennas, my favorite.
Right, because they're not just pretty to look at, they're crucial for transmitting and receiving those radio waves.
They are. They're like the eyes and ears of your radio station.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, so the guide does a deep dive on different types of antennas, starting with the dipole, which I always thought was interesting because it's so simple.
It is simple, but super effective, especially for HF operation.
So that's your two equal length wires fed in the center.
Exactly. Classic dipole.
Elegant in its simplicity.
I like that
Thank
description.
you.
And then, of course, you've got your vertical antennas.
Oh, yeah, those are the ones that look like they could pick up signals from, like, another planet.
Laughs. They do kind of look like that, don't they? Sticking up there in the air.
They're so cool. What are those best for?
They're great for VHF and UHF because they radiate signals in all directions.
Wow, that makes sense. So good for wide coverage.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay, but what about those directional ones, like the Yagi antennas?
Yeah.
Those always look so high-tech.
The Yagi. A classic for a reason.
Right, like something out of a movie.
They're also called beam antennas because they literally focus your signal in a specific direction.
So if you're trying to reach a specific station far away, that's the way to go.
Exactly. Like aiming a spotlight instead of just shining a light everywhere.
That's awesome. Okay, so we've covered the big ones, but what about those little, like, rubber ducky antennas you see on handheld radios?
Those are great.
Do those actually work?
They do. They're called whip antennas. And they're a type of vertical antenna. They just use this clever trick called loading to make them shorter,
Oh, interesting.
which is essential for portability, but there's a trade-off.
What's that?
They don't radiate as much power as a full-size antenna.
So it's like you can whisper to someone standing right next to you, but you gotta shout to be heard across a crowded room.
Perfect analogy.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm definitely adding antenna design to my list of things to learn more about.
It's a fascinating subject.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, but there's one more thing about antennas that I always forget about until it comes back to bite me, and that's polarization.
Yes, polarization. Important, but often overlooked.
Right. Can you remind me what that is again and why it matters?
Of course. So polarization, it refers to the orientation of the electric field of a radio wave. It can be vertical or horizontal.
Okay.
And ideally, you want your transmitting and receiving antennas to have the same polarization.
Why is that? What happens if they don't?
You lose signal strength.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's like trying to fit two puzzle pieces together that don't quite match up.
Right. They need to align properly.
Exactly. If your antenna is vertical and the station you're trying to contact has a horizontal antenna, you're not going to hear them very well.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like trying to talk to someone who speaks a different language.
Exactly. You might get a few words, but the communication is not going to be very clear.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, so we've talked about antennas, but remember those ham radio satellites or hamsats we mentioned earlier?
Oh, yeah, those are cool.
This guide blew my mind when it said that amateur radio operators actually build and launch these satellites themselves.
It's true. They do.
Like, how amazing is that?
It's incredible. It just goes to show you the dedication and passion within the ham radio community.
It's inspiring. Okay, so we know that hamsats are real, but what are they actually used for?
Well, they act like repeaters in space, basically.
Okay, so they're relaying signals over incredibly long distances.
Exactly. Because they're up there, above the atmosphere, they can bounce signals around the globe.
So you could potentially talk to someone on the other side of the world using one of these satellites.
Exactly. And because they're so high up, they have a much wider coverage area than a ground-based repeater.
That's amazing. Okay, but I have to ask, how do you even communicate with a satellite? It's not as simple as just pointing your antenna at the sky, right?
You're right. It's a little more complicated than that. You need some specialized equipment, for one.
Like what?
Well, you need a transceiver that can operate on the satellite's frequencies, a directional antenna that can track the satellite as it moves across the sky, and some software to help you predict when and where that satellite will be.
Wait, so the satellites are constantly moving?
Oh, yeah, they're orbiting the Earth, remember, so they're constantly on the move.
Oh, right, of course. I forgot about that part. So you need some serious tech to keep up with them.
You do, but it's worth it for the experience.
Oh, I bet. But okay, I have another question, and I know this might sound like a dumb question, but what is Doppler shift?
Not a dumb question at all. It's actually a really important concept in satellite communication.
Okay, good. So what is it?
Imagine the sound of a race car as it zooms past you, right?
Yeah.
The pitch of the engine seems to change as it gets closer and then farther away.
Oh, yeah, it goes like, ee. Oh.
Exactly. That's the Doppler effect, and it happens with radio waves, too.
Really?
Yeah, because the satellites are moving so fast relative to your location on Earth, that movement causes a shift in the frequency of the signals they send and receive.
So if you don't account for that shift, you won't be able to hear them very well.
Exactly. It's like trying to listen to a radio station that's constantly changing frequencies.
Oh, that would be so annoying.
Yeah, not a great listening experience. But thankfully, that software I mentioned earlier, it calculates all that for you.
Oh, thank goodness for technology. This is blowing my mind.
I did warn you, this hobby was more than just chatting across town.
Seriously, it's like a whole other level of radio wizardry.
That's one way to put it. But it's also a lot of fun, and there's always something new to learn and explore.
That's what I love about it.
Me too. It's
Well,
a hobby that keeps on giving.
okay, so it's like a digital signature, but for radio.
Exactly. Keeps everything legit.
I like it. Okay, you know what else I like? The fact that you can use ham radio to, like, control things remotely.
Oh, yeah. That's cool stuff.
It's not just for talking. I'm picturing, like, model airplanes and stuff.
Model airplanes, robots, you name it.
No way.
Yeah. But like with everything else, there are rules.
Of course. Of course.
Safety first, always.
Yeah.
Got to make sure those signals aren't interfering with anything important.
So no accidentally changing the channel on my neighbor's TV.
Probably best to avoid that, yeah.
Oh, okay, good to know. So it's like always be aware of your surroundings.
Exactly. And the potential impact of those radio waves.
Makes sense. Okay, on a different note, the guide mentions something called third-party traffic.
Ah, yes, third-party traffic. Basically relaying messages for someone who's not a licensed operator.
Oh, okay, so you can't do that.
Yep, not allowed.
Okay, so that makes sense. So it's really about keeping those airwaves reserved for licensed operators.
Exactly. It's a privilege, remember.
Right, right. Okay, so no third-party traffic, but what about using ham radio for, like, business?
Another no, unfortunately.
Really? So I can't, like, broadcast radio ads for my Etsy shop?
Probably not a good idea. There are other ways to promote your business.
Okay, fair enough. So ham radio, it's all about the love of the hobby, not about the money.
Exactly. Connecting with people, experimenting, serving the community.
Love that. Okay, speaking of recognition, the guide mentions amateur radio operator certificates.
Oh, yeah, those are cool.
What are those all about? Like, do you get a framed diploma for your shack wall?
Lefts. Not quite a diploma, but it is a form of recognition from the FCC.
Oh, official.
Yeah, they acknowledge operators for their skills and accomplishments.
That's awesome. So what are there different levels of certificates?
Kind of. There are certificates for all sorts of things, like demonstrating your Morse code skills, making contacts with stations in a certain number of countries, even participating in public service events.
That's so cool. It's like there's always a new challenge, always something to work towards.
Exactly. Keeps things interesting.
It really does. Okay, you know what else is interesting?
What's that?
Remember those ham radio satellites?
The HAMSATs.
Yeah. So they're not just for receiving signals. Ham radio operators can actually build and launch their own satellites.
It's true. It's amazing, isn't it?
It's incredible. I mean, we're talking about launching something into space here.
I know. It's a testament to the ingenuity and collaborative spirit of the ham radio community.
Right, like people coming together to literally reach for the stars.
I love that.
Yeah.
Because these satellites, they're not just for fun, although that's definitely part of it.
Right.
They can relay signals over insanely long distances, obviously.
Yeah, we talked about that.
But they also facilitate all sorts of experiments with new communication techniques.
Oh, that's right. Because you're not limited by, like, the Earth's atmosphere anymore.
Exactly. And they can even be used to teach students about space technology, which is really cool.
That's amazing. This deep dive, it's really opened my eyes.
Right. It's more than just a hobby. It's a gateway to all sorts of amazing things.
Seriously, it's like scientific exploration, technological innovation, global connection. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. And to think, it all starts with that technician class license.
That's true. It's like that first step that opens up a whole universe of possibilities.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe we'll hear some of our listeners on the airwaves someday.
That would be awesome. Okay. But seriously, this guide, it's been an incredible starting point for us and hopefully for our listeners too.
It's a great resource for anyone who's curious about ham radio, that's for sure.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, if you're even remotely intrigued by what you've heard today, we encourage you to dive in.
Yeah, what are you waiting for?
Explore the resources mentioned, find your local ham radio club, and who knows, maybe you'll discover your new passion.
The airwaves are waiting.